Hello, everyone. There we go. Welcome to our panel on standards and virtual reality. I'm Tony Parisi, your moderator. With me is Neville Spiteri, founder and CEO of WEVR, Yuval Boger, CEO of Sensics, Inc., Neil Schneider, founder of the Immersive Technology Alliance, very good, Brandon Jones, engineer on the Google Chrome team doing VR. I'm going to have everyone go down the line real quick and give us an intro bio so people know what everyone does, what your companies do. And then later on, we'll get into why you like standards and VR. Start, please, Neville.
Sure. Hi, I'm Neville Spiteri. I'm the founder and CEO of WEVR. We're a virtual reality startup based in Venice, Los Angeles. And we're a studio developing content for virtual reality headsets. And we are very excited about enabling a community of independent content creators to develop content for virtual reality systems. And therefore, we think there's a relevant discussion to be had around standards.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yuval Boger. I'm CEO of Sensics. Sensics has been making professional-grade VR equipment for over a decade. In recent years, we turned our attention more to the consumer domain, both with a medical device. And together with our friends at Razer, we introduced OSVR, open source virtual reality, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And Sensics architected the OSVR software stack and collaborated with Razer on the hardware.
So, well, my name is Neil Schneider. I serve as Executive Director for the Immersive Technology Alliance. I'm also the founder of Meant to Be Seen, or MTBS3D.com, which I'm very proud is regularly accredited as being the birthplace of Oculus. And as far as the ITA, it's a formal nonprofit organization. It's actually got a track record dating back to 2009. It was formally renamed to the ITA in 2014 with an expanded mandate to include virtual reality, augmented reality, and stereoscopic 3D. And our reason for being is to make immersive technology successful. And we do this by being a representative voice for the industry, as well as working groups and industry building efforts. And we'll talk about that a little later as well.
I'm Brandon Jones. I work at Google on the Chrome team, and I'm one of the crazy ones who looks at the crushing demands of VR on modern hardware and says, you know what would be good with that? JavaScript. And yeah, so I mostly work on WebGL, getting graphics, 3D graphics into the browser, but recently have been working in conjunction with Mozilla on getting a WEVR standard to allow you to interact with virtual reality headsets and other hardware in the browser.
Okay, and I'm Tony Parisi, moderator. I have a startup in San Francisco called Third Eye, building consumer VR interfaces to the world's information. Back about 20 years ago, as Bruce mentioned, I created the first ever standard for 3D on the web and arguably virtual reality called VRML, which we all know stands for way too fucking early. We didn't have any graphics chips in our computers. I mean, certainly didn't have the supercomputer we have in our pocket now in the form of our phone. We did not have broadband networking. We didn't have people who knew how to create web pages. So yeah, we were a bit early, but we did successfully, you know, I'll put that in air quotes, create a standard that lots of people were using for the time. So I think that's relevant to this panel, and I want to use that to kick off the idea about standards. We're going to have all the panelists talk about various aspects of standards, why we need them, why we might not, what works, what doesn't. But before we do that, I'd like to do a group exercise for a minute. I'd like to all of us to think about what it means to have standards. For example, let's think about a world that has no standards. And we're going to do that by doing a visualization exercise. I would like everybody to close your eyes and be absolutely quiet for 10 seconds. And 10. That is a world without standards. Imagine a world where you wouldn't be able to hear my voice because you wouldn't have microphone cables connected that talk standard signals. You probably wouldn't have the lights that are up on the ceiling. We might not even have this building. We might, in fact, all be sitting in a cave lit by candlelight with our riffs on, talking about VR. So with that in mind, let's kick this off for real. All right, so when you think about a standard, you think about something that's in a committee that takes too long to write and that nobody reads. There's a quote that we might be familiar with from lawmaking. Those who respect sausage and the law should watch neither being made. Same could also be said of standards. And yet, we all know, we all feel at least, that we probably need them for some reason or another, even in the world of virtual reality. If it's good enough for the real world, the lights, the camera, and the action we have in the real world, why not VR? So with that, I want to open it up to the panel in general and talk about why we're here to talk about standards. What matters in VR? Why do we even need to care about this now? People seem to be happily developing, doing the cool Unity demos, all that stuff we see on the show floor, essentially without a single standard. So why does anybody care? Who wants to go first?
Well, so talking from the perspective of the web browsers, which are all about standards, it's, there is an awful lot of, people sitting in a room and talking about what the right thing to do is. But ultimately, standards on the web are a lot more like Gladiator, where you put your standard together and you train it up and you hope it does well, and then you toss it out to the web community, and they will either love it or they will boo it and they will get eaten by lions. And I kind of forgot where I was going with that. But it really is a lot more exciting because it is something that's very community driven, and that's extremely visible on the web, but I think it's the same for standards at any level. You can put all the love and respect and attention that you want into a standard, but if you don't get the community to back you up, it's worthless. And that's just something that's more visible on the web than other places.
So for me, okay, so I'm going to describe, like a mentor of mine taught me this years ago. And there's no right and there's no wrong. It's just a fact of life. And there's two pillars in life. There's the money pillar and there's the pillar of, for love. And money is, if you have an army and you need to defeat an enemy, you could hire your mercenaries and they'll go to battle. The love pillar is, if you have a cause that's very important to the people, they'll go to battle for you, or for themselves because it's important to them. So, in my opinion, standards fall into that love pillar where you don't necessarily need a fortune and resources to make standards work, but they could be just as powerful, just as influential as as much money as much money can buy.
Okay. So, I think standards have a bad rap, right? As you said, they take forever to create. No one likes them. So we sometimes call them common interfaces, which is sort of better. So imagine if Ford, Chrysler, and GM couldn't agree on a common interface for the fuel pump into their cars, right? So what would happen is that you'd have gas stations for Ford, and gas stations for Chryslers, and gas stations for BMW, so on and so on. So that's, even though they're competitors, they have a common interest to say, oh, this is going to be the type of fuel and the diameter of the hose, and everything we need to know, so there could be one gas station for everyone. So when we thought about OSVR, we also thought about, okay, so what's out there in the world of VR? Well, we see 100 different peripherals. We see dozens of peripheral types, locomotion devices and eye trackers and skeletons and gesture engines and eye trackers and position trackers and HMDs, of course, and audio and so on. And then we see a whole bunch of game engines or people who are trying to write to them. So Unity and Unreal and CryEngine and the web, of course, and others. And we said, wow, this doesn't make any sense. So if I'm writing a hardware piece, now I'm going to have to create a driver for Unity and a driver for Unreal and a driver for Cry and a driver for this and that and the other. And that's a pain in the neck. It's a pain in the neck for me as a hardware vendor, and it's a pain in the neck for Unreal because they're going to have to support 50 others like me. And then if one of us doesn't do it, then how do I get my hardware on the market? How do users know that they can actually run a game or an application across all this hardware? I still keep in my inbox, I send it around, a download page for WordPerfect for printer drivers. Once upon a time, that was a little bit before VR, or before modern VR, when you bought a new printer, you had to upgrade your word processor. Today, you don't, because your operating system has a print services layer that says, oh, I know, here's a printer, I'll get the driver, and all the apps can talk in the same way to the print services layer. So when we think about standards for OSVR, we think about a common interface like the print services and scanner services and fax services of the desktop. We want to say, here's how you talk to an eye tracker regardless of what vendor it's coming from. Here's how you talk to a position tracker. Here's a gesture engine, and so on and so on. And once we threw that out in the market, everyone said, yeah, that's great, because I don't want to write that 100 drivers, and I wanted the user to make sure that he can run my hardware as soon, and I can actually get new versions, new hardware out using the same interface and not have to republish the game. So that's why we think they're important.
Very good.
So we come at it from the standpoint of the content. I personally got into virtual reality early on in 1991 was the first time I read a book and spent most of my time working in film and games. And when I look around, there's this sort of emergent passion and desire for a lot of people to get involved with VR because of the promise of these amazing VR experiences where we can put a headset on and sort of trip out in a way that we haven't been able to do before. And so from that standpoint, just even in the last couple of years, right, where initially VR was synonymous with the word Oculus, but already just in a couple of 24 months, there's all of these new headsets and input systems, and I'm constantly having conversations with writers, directors, producers who want to be able to tell their story in VR. They want to make sure they can reach their audience. They want to make sure that if they're going to go to the trouble of creating a masterpiece or a work of art, that everybody can check it out, whether you're on a cardboard or you're on a HTC Vive system. And so, rather than thinking of standards as a sort of a solution looking for a problem, there's actually a real problem that's very quickly emerging, where there is a need for some standardization around content creation systems, publishing systems, to ultimately enable this content explosion that we'd all like to see. Whether you're a money-driven, looking to sell your headsets, or whether you're love-driven because you want to, share your story with as many people. So it's very much a problem that we're looking to figure out the right standards to address.
I should add, there's no rush to standards. A standard isn't a timeline. A standard is a goal.
Yeah.
I mean, there are cautionary tales where standards were rushed and thrown out there to exist, and it's killed industries. I mean, we have to be very cautious. I think the benefit of a standard is it's, yes, of course it's an end goal, it's an end sight, but it's a catalyst for wonderful conversation and to learn. I mean, the joke is, oh, we don't know enough about VR. Well, now we have a motivation to do just that because we want to make sure we get it right. So this expectation that standards are being rushed to market, no. What's being rushed is to get people to talk to each other. That's the most important aspect of standard development.
Well, you guys all sound so reasonable. You make this sound like such a straightforward proposition. And yet, it's been my experience, and believe me, I'm not pushing standards in my conversations these days, but when I talk to individual developers, they're out there trying to get their Unity app built or whatever for Rift, or you talk to some other folks in industry who are a player with maybe a certain stake in the game, and you don't hear the same kind of responses. You hear more like, why would anyone bother with that? The kind of some of it's sort of this manic defense of, well, we're never going to need that, or it's just never going to be possible, too technically intractable. Sort of a range of rebellious responses to that, and I'm wondering why that is.
When you say rebellious responses to that, who's being rebellious?
Well, I don't want to name names.
No, let me rephrase the question. Like, is it a technology maker, a content maker, or
a little of both, right? So I wonder what that's all about. And I want to put this to the panel. I've already gone off script, by the way, guys. Probably throw this out soon. So I want to put this to the whole panel. I mean, why do we think that is? Who are the stakeholders? Why might people not want standards? Why might people not get it? Are they not thinking about the right stuff? And I'm just a little shocked, Amy, because in so many other industries, as I opened up with, it's a kind of obvious need. So why does there seem to be a somewhat defensive reaction in this realm? Why don't you kick it off, Neil, just because you were, it's kind of picking up off your last point a little bit.
Well, it's in my opinion, it's about IP. I mean, how do you defend your product? If you're a content maker, standards are beneficial because not everybody's going to get the marketing deal. Like, not everybody's going to get that funding for their game if they support a certain platform. I mean, if this industry is really going to grow to be a huge industry, it's an unrealistic expectation that everyone's going to get a paycheck from a given manufacturer. It's not the way the world works. But if you're an IP holder and for whatever reason your IP isn't defendable, like maybe it's not unique enough compared to the other products, maybe it's not where the profit margins are going to be, standards aren't necessarily the most effective way to go for interoperability standards. But there are other standards that everyone has a vested interest in, which has nothing to do with direct compatibility, that impacts platform to platform. Like I'll give you a perfect working example: quality assurance. If I was a judge at a VR event last year, I won't name which one, and we had countless submissions for virtual reality and augmented reality. And I tested every single submission. Like must have been like 100 submissions divided by 4 judges. Each judge had to do 25 submissions. The majority of the content was unwatchable. Like, it was absolutely horrible. And so I actually reached out to the head judge, and I said, you know what, I'd really like you to look this through because I'm concerned that I'm scoring things too low. Maybe my eyes aren't quite right. And he said, no, go with it. So we actually had a lot of difficulty finding adequate content to declare as winners of this particular event. Now, what's the ramifications of this? So we've got a lot of different head mounts and devices that are coming to market. Many haven't been announced yet. Many are in the works. Content makers, really, they want to support as much as they can. It's in their business interest to do so. But imagine if you're a company with millions of dollars behind you and you've invested a lot of marketing dollars and that your product is great, but your competitors who you have absolutely no control over are releasing content that isn't so great. Well, for a consumer, I mean, if we think back at the recent 3D days, they're going to have the same expectations. It doesn't matter how much you have in terms of marketing dollars or how good your personal content is. People are going to have that expectation. So, when we're talking about standards, it's a very big, ball of wax. It's not limited to interoperability. There's all kinds of standards that the industry very much does have to get on, and it's to their joint benefit to get involved with.
One thing that I think is really important about standards is that it offers freedom in a lot of cases. And this, going back and touching on something from one of our first sessions today, you had a whole bunch of people up here who represented different facets of the VR industry, and somebody gets up to the mic and says, well, what about this particular type of content that you guys all seem squeamish supporting? What are you going to do about that? Well, in a proprietary system, of course, they can say, well, we just don't want that associated with our brand, and then you're done. But if you have standards in place with multiple people implementing them, multiple marketplaces, multiple paths that all follow the standards, you have the freedom to say, okay, well, maybe you don't want my content, but maybe this group over here does. The web is very good at this. Web don't judge. You can put whatever you want up on there. And the beautiful thing about it is that, me personally, I could kind of care less about the porn industry. But the porn industry is more than welcome to use the standard that I'm working on, and I don't have to approve it. I don't have to sign off on it. I don't have to give them a thumbs up. And that goes way beyond the adult industry. It goes to anything that might be politically sensitive. It might, anything like that. Standards give these groups the ability to explore the type of content that they want without gatekeepers.
Yeah, I think, exactly. That sort of touches on, it's actually probably a broader topic than standards, and that's the whole issue of closed versus open systems. And, there's a history of kind of media systems going from phases of being open to being closed, dating back to cable, and before that, and radio. I mean, there's sort of a pattern to kind of this oscillation between open and closed systems. And to your point, right, with the web, The web does represent today an opportunity for open systems and open sharing of information, and there's a whole topic around that and how that's being potentially jeopardized, et cetera, and the stake and the issues that are at stake there. So, you know, given that's at play, and given that you do have IP controllers or hardware manufacturers that are potentially interested in shipping their devices, which is perfectly legitimate, it's a vital aspect of the ecosystem. Within that open versus closed, you know, where does virtual reality sit? You know, our thesis is that virtual reality is too important. It's actually too important and too potentially impactful for humanity to be relegated to controlled app stores. That we should be really thinking about you know, how is actually virtual reality content going to be regulated, shared? What are the rules at play? Is it up to a handful of oligopolies to determine exactly how what content is available and distributed? So that's an even bigger, broader topic. And I think standards comes into it because if there is a pipe that's built that allows open sharing of information, then that's, you know, worthwhile.
So I wanted to pick up on one word from you, Brandon, which is freedom. And we thought a lot about freedom when we created OSVR and decided to open up all the various interfaces, including the hardware and the source code of the software. The issue is that building a VR system is a multidisciplinary and a complex undertaking. You have to understand optics and electronics and motion tracking and GPUs and sensors and so on and so on. And not many companies can do a soup to nuts job, and a decent one at that, at getting the whole stack done. Sensics could, we've been doing it for years, but we said innovation is not limited to Sensics. It's not limited to Google, it's not limited to Facebook, just to name the big three, right? And Samsung and Valve and others. So we said, look, if we open the interfaces and there's a guy in Japan who's an expert in eye tracking, he doesn't have to build the whole thing. He can just insert his eye tracking. And if there's another guy who says, this panelist is waving his hands in the air, and I can translate that to a figure 8 and say to the application there's a figure 8 gesture, let him focus on his piece of the expertise. And that freedom also allows system to configure the hardware that they want. If you have a closed system and your vendor doesn't want to offer, you know, eye tracking, what are you going to do? But if you have an open system, then go to 5 different eye tracking vendors, assuming they support the same interface, pick the one that's best for you in performance or price or what have you, and use it. So we think freedom is a key driver for VR, and that's why we decided to open up innovation. And if anything, in the 4 or 5 months that OSVR has been publicly in existence, we are floored by the contributions that we get from people who we've never met, who we've never knew that existed, that say, hey, I want to contribute, I've got this piece of expertise, and I'm glad to jump on your open interface and contribute it there.
Awesome. So here we are, we're feeling good about the idea of standards in VR. Let's get specific. What areas of standardization do you believe are going to be important, vital, have a lot of energy behind them? Software level, APIs, content and formats. Let's open that up. We're going to start it with you, Yuval, because it's a great segue, actually. So what are the standards we think are going to emerge? Let's get very specific now and start painting a picture of what we might think individually, and then maybe even collectively something might emerge for where the VR standards are going to hit first and be the most important.
So in a very simplistic setting, we think of VR as 2 parts, sensing and rendering. So sensing says, here's the input, here's what the user's trying to do, you know, body posture, EEG, voice, hands, anything you're doing. And then rendering is, okay, what picture do I need to draw, and how do I draw it as quickly and as efficiently onto the graphics card? We think that there's a lot of time sensitivity and hardware-specific optimizations that at this phase need to be done on the rendering side. And some of it is now being baked into the NVIDIA cards and ATI and others. But we decided that we are going to start with opening up the standards for sensing, because that's at a slightly lower bandwidth and a much wider choice. So we've started looking at devices, not so much by the vendor, but what they do. So for instance, bringing on a desktop analogy, if you have a multifunction printer, then it's a printer and a scanner and a fax and maybe a copier. So that's 4 different interfaces that just happen to be rolled up into one device. So when we look at VR, we say, OK, there's tracking, meaning position and orientation tracking. There's eye tracking. There's what we call an imager interface, which is cameras. There's gesture interface. There's a skeleton interface, which could be, sort of leap motion, soft kinetic, Intel RealSense, finger skeletons or full body skeletons, and a couple others. And we've put all the proposed specifications on GitHub together with all the companies that wish to help us in that endeavor. And I think we're going to narrow it down to 7 or 8 classes of interfaces, types of interfaces that should do a fairly good job for now in covering pretty much everything out there.
And so just to clarify, so in terms of OSVR, it was kind of practical choice at this point to not think about the rendering and content side now just because of how you have to solve those problems? Is that,
well, that too, and also a practical matter in terms of, game developers say, oh, I want to use Unity, I want to use Unreal, I'm not even thinking about going to a different engine. So we didn't want to create an engine at this point, but to say, Unreal doesn't have eye tracking support right now. So here's an opportunity to standardize eye tracking and get it into Unreal, for instance.
All right, Neil, jump in, man, you're ready.
I just wanted to ask, who's we?
Whoever wants to go on GitHub and contribute.
No, let me rephrase. Like you said, we decided. Who's we?
We put up an initial.
Who's we?
We, Sensics, not WEVR, right? Sensics put up an initial proposal, said, hey, it's on GitHub, it's open, and then Razer and Sensics started approaching companies and say, let's talk about skeletons. Who do we know that does skeletons? Okay, these 7 companies. Let's reach out to them, say, here's why a standard is good for you. You're going to sell more devices. You're going to have more content. Would you please work with us in the open, right? Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Work with us in the open to create a proposed interface. Sensics is going to write a generic plugin for OSVR. You're going to write the device-specific one. So think about, print services layer, and then you can all write your specific printer drivers.
So OSVR is a group. It's an open group?
It's an open group.
Join?
Anyone can join.
I think that's what Neil's getting at, right? Or are we
like
worried about the smoke-filled rooms?
Now, we don't have smoke-filled rooms. We don't have regular. I used to work at many years ago with the ATM forums. And what I felt about them is that they have a standard. They do it in Belgium. And then for magical reason, the printer that they print is in Paris, so they have to go there for the next meeting, and then to New York. So it was sort of a way to see the world, join the ATM forum. That doesn't happen anymore. We sort of just do it there. I think that at some point, the community, and maybe it's the ITA, feels that this is important enough to get into the smoke-filled rooms. I mean, for instance, you're going to not want to do a standard for teleporting, like body beam me up, right? Because there is not a lot of teleporting machines right there that you know what's important and what's less important. So we just say the OSVR community, which by now is about 100 companies in 5 months, say, hey, let's get it out there. Let's see what works, what doesn't work. And at some point, yeah, we should definitely turn it into a formal standards organization. But for now, it's just a consortium of saying, this is what we think could work and what could not work.
Gotcha. Neil, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, it's just, when I think of a standard, okay, like if we're going to talk about an open standard, I think of it as, everyone is part of it, but also everyone's got an equal vote. Everyone's involved in the key decisions. There's a process. And usually when you have a formal standard or a formal effort, there's an organization behind that. And in this case, like, is there an organization? Like, how would you describe the structure of OSVR?
I think OSVR today is an open source project, meaning with open source project, there's a group of maintainers. So hypothetically, you could make a contribution, and I or someone on my team could say, I don't like Neil, and I'm just going to reject his contribution. But obviously, that's not a good strategy for building the community, and so that's just not going to happen.
So let's come back to that, guys, because we're actually going to talk about open source in the very next question here. But I want to get Brandon and Neville's thoughts on this. So what do you think is important to be looking at standardizing? We've heard about a lot about input from Yuval.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that that's important to standardize. That's what I'm working on with Mozilla right now, to standardize on the website. But to take a slightly different tack from that, another thing I think is important to standardize is content formats, stuff like that. When you pull up a web page and somebody says, oh, look at this adorable cat picture, you can probably view the adorable cat picture without thinking about what format it's in. It's probably JPEG. But we're going to need some of the same things for VR, and this is going to happen a little bit down the road. It's not an immediate need, but people should be thinking about it right now. It's something that the community can actively be contributing to, even if they don't have access to the people who are making the hardware. Where we're going to eventually need standards around what a 360-degree stereo cat video looks like. We're going to need standards around what a cat light field looks like. We're going to need standards around, how to, probably just how to coexist in a virtual space. And, people like Samsung, through Milk VR and whatnot, they're working on these kind of things right now. Whether or not the codecs that they're producing are actually open standards, I actually don't know. But content is, we want to get to a point with virtual reality, especially if it's going to be a social medium, where we actually have standardized ways of communicating imagery, sound, data between one another. And it's a world away from the input and the output standards that we're talking about, but it is going to ultimately be very important.
How about you, Neville?
Totally agree. So in addition to input and rendering, we very much think about, again, coming from the content perspective, it's the media format, right? It's the content format. So whether it's format to describe 360 video, whether it's a format to describe new ways of defining story triggers and interactivity, locating 3D audio sources, there's a whole set of multimedia components that are involved in describing and delivering a virtual reality experience. And frankly, there's actually very little discussion about that happening. So we're finding ourselves spending a lot of time thinking through what are the characteristics of virtual reality media format. Do you go from an MP4 file where you're playing a linear video, even if it's 360, ultimately it's a linear piece of media, or you have to jump all the way over to a full 3D engine and write an application from scratch, not necessarily in a standard way. So we are, again, not making this up ourselves, but we're hearing from the community very loud and clear that, hey, we need some kind of standardization around how we describe this VR media format and how we play it back. And I think there's going to be an opportunity for new kinds of browsers and new kinds of playback systems. And it's already starting to happen, and so we would like to start to actually engage in conversations like this with a broader community that's interested in helping flesh out what that might look like.
Thought on that one?
You have a committee? Well, we do. We have, in fact, it's going to be tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. We're having a big panel, and we're going to be announcing some really cool stuff, which is applicable to you in a good way as well. I'm sorry, I feel badly a little bit about beating that information out of you, but it's good. Good. It's good.
In the morning panel was about porn, and this is about cats?
I had an idea, actually.
Which would you prefer to talk about?
I can't tell.
we should standardize virtual reality naked people movies. Like, that's our next opportunity. But the thing is, my wife would yell at me, you still have what to learn before you standardize. So anyway, I digress.
Okay, so then I'm just going to quickly follow up on that. This is a multiple choice question for each of the panelists, and you can only answer yes, no, maybe. In 5 years, will there be an MPEG or JPEG of virtual reality? Brandon.
Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Will there be an MPEG or JPEG, a standard format for virtual reality? Brandon says yes.
In how much time?
No, yes, no, maybe. You get one answer, one word.
Yes, for sure.
5 years.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. You started talking about open source. You started arguing about open source. We got into that. I like that. We're about to have our first fight, maybe. What do you see as the relationship between open source and open standards? I mean, these days, you got GitHub. You can build something, you put an open source project out there. You got an open source browser, essentially, right? People can do all kinds of stuff with it. Some of that actually makes it into the Chrome mainline at some point. Why do we need open standards when we have this wonderful global sandbox we can play in to just add features as we need to without standards committees, without all the friction that comes with grinding that sausage? And I'm going to start with you, Brandon, since you've got a foot in both worlds.
Okay. We need standards, and we need them, ultimately to be open. Although to diverge a little bit, one thing that you were talking about is, open standards, open source. There is a lot of confusion that those are one and the same. And that's not necessarily true. A wonderful example is the Cronus Group. They maintain OpenGL. The open in OpenGL does not stand for open source. You can't go download the source for your GL drivers, well, maybe on Linux, but if you're lucky. But they are an open group. Anybody can join and put in their 2 cents. And what's important there is that you have expertise that's actually contributing to the discussion. Let me tell you that in the open source community, if you open up your project to contributions from anyone, you get contributions from anyone. And it's not always productive, and it's not always taken in the direction that you want the project to go, and it's not always well informed. And so a lot of times what you need is not necessarily a completely public, completely open source discussion, but a discussion of the people who have, a lot of domain knowledge about a particular subject, who come together and say, okay, based on our previous experience, this is what we know needs to happen, this is what we hope will happen, and this is what we'd like to drive towards happening. And you don't get people coming in going, so it'd be so cool if, because that rarely leads to productive discussion.
So open source, it's not a free-for-all. And that's, I'll give you an example. So on MTBS, we developed the Variable Perception VR drivers. They're open source drivers, which means they're free to download. The source code is readily available for anyone to download, to look at, to modify the whole thing. But there is a portion of that code which we keep closed source because we think it's a security risk. We think that it's not something that we want in the public, because then there would be cause to not be supportive of the Variable Perception drivers. But they make the software work really well, which is why we keep it closed source. Still freeware. It's still free to download. It's just that you can't get the source code and modify it. Now, in the virtual reality world, yes, you can open source things. Okay, anything that you don't, if you have IP that you don't really care about, you're open source it, get it out there. But if you have a secret sauce, if you have something that's unique to your product, something that you don't want others to have, that you're counting on for your livelihood, then that's something that would be closed source. So if it's closed source, then the big question becomes, well, who owns that platform? So is it yours? Is it by the platform holder? Like where does that go? So that's that's a different ball of wax. But that's it's completely separate from open source. It's a completely separate discussion. So yeah. So open standards, open source, completely different things. One is strictly a licensing term. The other is a open standard very different. It's like a mentality and a method for building standards.
So when you write software, one of the first questions is, what are you trying to get that software to do? And I think the open interface says, okay, you need to write a head tracker driver that achieves this interface. Now, it may be that you say, I'm just going to open source the driver, because then I'll get people to port it to a different operating system or to improve it. Or you might say, for instance, OSVR works with Leap Motion, and Leap Motion has some really unique software that takes data from their camera and does the magic. So they have an OSVR plugin, but a closed source algorithm. And the design of the OSVR platform allows for closed source code if necessary. But I think that the fact open source, it encourages innovation, and in this stage of the VR market, we just want to move forward fast. So, for instance, we today announced that OSVR supports a couple of new engines, SteamVR being one of them, Vorpex, which people use to run sort of traditional games on VR, and the third one is Monogame. Monogame is an open source Microsoft XNA implementation. Trust me, it was not even in our second tier roadmap. I didn't know it existed. Maybe it's just me.
But doing everything out in the
But then
open,
someone said,
it.
hey, I really like Monogame, and I'm going to take your example driver, and I'm going to do a Monogame port, and bam, we've got a Monogame plugin. So I think at this stage, there's a ton to benefit from open sourcing, although there is a mechanism to say, this is my special algorithm. I'm going to close source it. By the way, if it's closed source and someone comes up with a better algorithm to do the same thing, then they don't have to use the closed source one. They could use the open source one. But you can do both ways.
Yeah, it's also almost a survival issue, right? So as a startup, we're in the process of fundraising and having pretty thoughtful discussions about the state of the ecosystem in VR and what's needed and what isn't. And one of the challenges we see is that a lot of individual companies and teams are having to build the entire software stack because it's early days in a new medium. And so there is a pretty fundamentally strong case to be made why open source, or at least if not fully open, where you're taking commits from a developer community, but at least you're transparent and you have read-only source systems, to encourage sort of cooperation versus duplication of effort, and it actually becomes very relevant and a very important factor in terms of sort of considering a way forward. And there's also pages we can take out of the enterprise space, where it used to be the case that if you've got your big data systems running on proprietary commercial databases, that you are better off than running on open standards-based systems. But as we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, that has very much shifted, where even sort of the major enterprises don't want to necessarily bet on closed proprietary systems, but they want to know that their deep IT is actually, that behind it is an open standard, so and an open source system. So there's a lot to consider there in terms of the approach and the best foot forward.
So we're going to do one more question for the panel, then we're going to open it up to the audience. So a lot of this feels like inside baseball. We're all industry people. We're talking about, hey, we've been around. We know this stuff. We know we're going to need some standards, and it matters to us because we kind of get it, right? But really, at the end of the day, what is the value of the standard to an end user or a developer? The stakeholders that really matter in all this. People are trying to deliver the end experiences too, and the folks who are trying to make the content. Neville, would you start us off on that?
Yep. Definitely. I think the measure actually is sort of the consumer, the end user, and what's available to them. And I think in that respect, thinking through how the quality of VR experiences can be increased as a function of various companies and producing systems that are investing in various layers of the stack to create that content, and sort of in that context, it comes back very much to how do you enable the consumer and how do you deliver a high quality of experience. And kind of you trace it back from there, and very quickly you start to think about the producer of the content and how are you providing systems to enable the producer and increase efficiencies for the content creation process. And then you track it back from there, and very quickly you start to see that having some sort of standardization around content formats and not having to write device drivers at lower ends in the stack becomes pretty vital.
So for the consumer, look at your living room, maybe you have a TV and a DVD player and a set-top box and maybe a streamer. And if you're happy to buy them from a single company, and when you want to upgrade, you have to throw out everything and buy 5 different new pieces, good for you. But if you want to be able to do it piecemeal, then you need some standard, whether it's HDMI or something that says I can replace one piece instead of the other. So there's a new HMD on the market. I want to take that HMD, plug it into, and keep running my game. And I really like my Razer Hydra, so I'm just going to keep it. But now there's this something else. And the other one is choice. You can have any car you can have any car you want as long as it's black. No, I actually want my cars green, right? So the ability to say, I will choose what I want to use as a gamer instead of having, someone at Cupertino or someone at some other city choose for me is a good thing in my opinion.
So obviously for a consumer, you're probably going to hear it right down the panel, interoperability. The freedom to choose whichever hardware you want. If that's the standard, we're talking about interoperability. And for a content maker, it's freedom, right? It's the freedom to code and know that you're going to have that, that maximum reach for your product. But as I said, there are other standards that are jointly beneficial, which have nothing to do with interoperability. I'll share with you one quick story, if it's okay. I was on a panel, I won't say when, so you don't trace it back. And one of the other panelists, who was very senior at a huge studio, made a remark. He said, oh, well, we were advised that, people who use this particular product can only use it for 15 minutes at a time, and then they have to take the device off, and then they're allowed to use it 15 minutes more. And then, which was a ridiculous expectation because, they were trying to market these like multi-hour experiences. It just wasn't compatible. So, so I asked, well, who said this? And he named the brand, and I said, well, look at this room. This industry is much bigger than this one brand. I mean, you're effectively doing everything by one voice, and that may not be even in your best interest. There's a big industry here with all kinds of devices and abilities. It's something to consider. So really, and also, I don't know if you remember the 3D days. I'm not going to name any brands, but when the first 3D televisions came out, there were all kinds of claims like pregnant women shouldn't wear 3D glasses and don't drink beer while you're watching 3D. All kinds of things that were put out in the open without anyone really, as an industry, questioning it, whether it was the right direction to go for the industry. So I know we're talking about standards, and I know we're talking about interoperability and APIs and the software, but really the core about this is talking to each other and having proper forums and channels to work through and to figure out what the core issues, because the standard is the means to an end. It's not, it's answering a problem that needs to be solved. And the first step is to really speak as an industry to define those problems. And then the standards will naturally fall into place. Anyway, that's my take. Thank you.
So consumers, again, we're getting really boring here because, I mean, it really is all about consumers. Like, there's exactly one group who benefits from vendor lock-in, and that is the vendor who is locking you in. Whereas if you have standards, then it's the consumer that wins in that case. Slightly different take on this, because I think all of the previous mentioned cases were good, but standards are good. We do like to talk about VR as a social thing. That's why Facebook bought Oculus. But in that case, I don't know about the rest of you, but I go through this about once a week where it's like, okay, well, I want to do a video call with family members, and well, let's get my mom on the phone, and well, we can't do FaceTime with her. Does she have Hangouts installed? I don't really know. Well, maybe we can do Skype. And no, that means that she has to get her computer out and blah, 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 all this different stuff. Whereas, you know, if we could get some standards in that, and there are standards in that world, they just don't get followed very much. But, you know, we don't want that same problem in VR. We want to be able to communicate freely with each other and not say, well, geez, I would love to jump into this meta space with you, but, well, I have an OSVR headset and you have an Oculus headset, and, you know, it's just not going to work out. We want to avoid that. And so it not only benefits individual consumers, but our ability to, you know, communicate with each other when we have standards in place.
Awesome. So we have about 2 minutes for questions. Please line up here on the mics if you want to do that. And just do want to remind people, we do have an emerging, at least open source project, sort of nascent standard OSVR that Yuval was talking about. We also have APIs in the browser called WEVR. By no means a standard yet, but if you look it up, you'll see there's JavaScript APIs for doing browser-based stuff. Works in Chrome, works in Firefox, works the same. That's awesome. Let's go quick on the questions because we're running a tiny bit behind. You over there. You don't have a mic.
There's one over here.
That's why we moved over here.
Everybody
Hi,
line up.
so, or someone could shuttle the mic back and forth. I've been very, very involved in standards. I was just working on MHL and HDMI, and I formed the Open eBook Forum. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. As a marketing guy, I find standards are interesting from watching press say, this device is great, and it will work with blah, blah, blah. It implements this, it implements that. Checkboxes. I mean, is anybody going to use it? Who the hell cares if the reviewer from TechCrunch or Gizmondo or Wall Street Journal or The Times says it suits these standards? So I know we have a very technical panel, but I'd like to hear from you, from the marketing standpoint, how important are standards, even if you resent them, that you have to do them from just a business development standpoint?
So I'll take an initial crack at this. Hopefully, not at all. When was the last time you bought a phone that had a check mark on the back of the box that said supports MPEG-4? You know, you don't, because it's just assumed to be there. You know, that's the benefit of a standard really taking hold and becoming ubiquitous, which is what everybody hopes to get to. And yeah, in the transition period, it may become a checkbox, but you know, ultimately, the end goal of, I think, most standards is to get to a point where you just don't have to think about it, and it's no longer worthy of that checkbox.
We're just going to let that answer stand so we can get to more questions. Damon.
Yeah, Tony, you're excluded from this question, but for the rest of you, I'd just like to know, you know, Web3D and standards are obviously nothing new thanks to the guy sitting on the end. So how are you working with current Web3D standards organizations, right? Because I mean, so much of the problems of standards is people try to reinvent the wheel. So I'm curious, how are you working with now a 20-year-old organization around 3D standards on the web?
Two guys in the middle.
Okay, so we actually, I could speak to Kronos. I mean, the president of Kronos, Neil Trevitz, on our advisory board. He's been a tremendous mentor for the ITA, and Kronos continually is very supportive of our efforts. And then, but again, I'll pass it on to yourself. I mean, we have working groups, but it's very early.
OSVR focuses at the moment on the input. We try to work with every engine. You know, we're looking at working with WebVR as well. And so you can make the choice on the engine that you want to use on top of OSVR.
They're going Big Tent. Last question. Sorry, we're just running out of time.
I have a very quick question. So for standard for virtual reality, do you think it should be some non-profit third party to make this standard? Because for OSVR, at the back end is Razer. Like for us, we are like input device developer. So do you think it should be some organization, I don't know, SVVR, some third party non-profit organization making this, not some big company doing that?
All right, yeah, Neil, you got to take this.
Okay, well, the Immersive Technology Alliance is a formal nonprofit organization. So we have a board of directors who I answer to. I don't have voting rights within the organization. You know, it's based in Canada, but it's an international. So as far as our role in standards development, we do have internal working groups. Everyone who joins the alliance, they sign a non-disclosure agreement. They keep their own IP. There's a formal structure in how we do things. There's going to be an announcement tomorrow that will be even more influential with this. And by the way, this is good for OSVR as well. I think you'll agree. So short answer, definitely, because the whole, one of the criteria for an open standard versus a platform is, being nonprofit is key, which is why that was the first thing we did versus, doing it later on.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we're out of time. Thanks so much, audience. I want to thank our panelists.
Can I just mention really quick? I apologize
Sorry.
that we didn't have a mic on this end of the room. I know that excluded some people from being able to ask questions. So if the rest of the panelists could stick around
Yeah,
after
we'll
we
be
get
over
off
there
stage,
somewhere.
please
There's
come
another
find
thing.
us if you wanted to ask something. I don't want questions to go unasked because of a technical glitch.
Or we'll just see you right out in the hallway here, but we had another thing coming on up here. So thanks to the panelists, Brandon Jones from Google, Neil Schneider from Immersive Technology Alliance, Yuval Boger from Sensics, and Neville Spiteri from WEVR. Thanks very much. Round of applause.